Adjunct Professor Moran, Microeconomics 112. In our last discussion, we reviewed the concept of elasticity of demand, and we wanted to discover whether a price change would cause a large change in quantity demand or a small change in quantity demand. In other words, can consumers actually react to a price change? We know demand is negative, but how negative is it? If consumers can change the quantity they are willing and able to purchase a great deal to a change in price, then demand is said to be relatively elastic. If consumers are unable to change their quantity demanded to a change in price, it is said to be inelastic. For example, if there are many substitutes and a price change happens, there will be a relatively larger change in quantity demand, perhaps for soda, where there are many substitutes. But if consumers can't change how much quantity demanded they have in response to a change in price, perhaps because there are a few substitutes like gasoline, then demand is said to be inelastic. We'd like to do the same thing with supply and measure the elasticity of supply. The price mechanism is very useful at regulating the amount produced by producers. So if there is an increase in price, we would like that signal to be translated to producers to produce more, increase the quantity supplied. And it's a decrease in price that consumers are sending producers. It's a signal that they should produce less. But the elasticity of supply will describe this for us. Can this actually happen? Can businesses, producers, actually react to this price mechanism? And that's what the elasticity of supply is about. So let's begin by discussing how to calculate elasticity of supply. We want to know, is supply relatively elastic, supply being a positive relationship between price and quantity, or relatively inelastic? Given the same change in price, comparing two separate goods, what will be the change in quantity supplied relative to the other? Here we can see that for this change in price, there will be a relatively large change in quantity supplied. This is relatively elastic. Here, there is a much smaller reaction to the same price change, so this is relatively inelastic. Okay. We're going to calculate the elasticity of supply with a formula. Elasticity of supply equals change in quantity supplied as a percentage divided by the percentage change in price as a percentage. Calculating this, when the number is greater than 1, then supply is said to be elastic. When the elasticity of supply is less than 1, then it is inelastic. We're not actually going to calculate the elasticity of supply as we did for elasticity of demand, but that's the formula. And you can see that when the quantity changes as a percentage more than the change in price, when the numerator is larger than the denominator, you'll have a ratio that's greater than 1. When quantity is less responsive as a percentage than the change in price as a percentage, then the ratio will be less than 1. The elasticity of supply is determined primarily by two considerations. One is time, and the other is the nature of the good produced. Notice that we don't have to take the absolute value of the elasticity of supply the way we had to take the absolute value of the elasticity of demand. That's because demand is always a negative, and so there's no point really saying -1, -3, so we just do the absolute value. Well, the supply is a positive relationship, so there's no need to take the absolute value. In the short run, let's talk about time first. In the short run, supply is more inelastic. In the long run, supply is more elastic. Given an immediate change in price, businesses may not actually be able to change their production output. but over time they may be able to react to the change in price. So for example, if the price of oil goes up, supply may be relatively inelastic. They may not actually be able to produce more oil because it takes a long time to find more places to drill oil wells, build the facilities to get the oil out of the ground to ships, and then take it to refineries. So in the short run, supply will be relatively inelastic. A small change in quantity in response to an increase in price in this example. But in the long run, businesses may react by producing more oil. The curve will flatten out in the long run. And that's because in the long run, they will try to respond to that change in price by discovering new sites to pump oil and get the facilities necessary to bring it to market. So in the long run, businesses are more able to react to a change in price than in the short run. Demand is more elastic in the long run, more inelastic in the short run. Also, the nature of the good produced will also determine whether the supply elasticity is relatively elastic or inelastic. So for natural resources, so we have short run and long run, now we have natural resources. We'll have a more inelastic supply curve because nature is nature. If the price of milk goes up and you go out to the barn and ask the cow to work overtime, you're the farmer, you say to the cow, hey, there's been an increase in the price of milk, we'd like to add a second shift and have you work instead of just 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., we'd like to work you from 4 p.m. to midnight. The cow's just going to look at you blankly and not understand what you're talking about. In order to increase the supply of milk, you have to do what's called increasing the herd size, which means you have to get a candle, a bottle of wine, and leave the cow and a bull in the barn for a period of time, and after 9 months you'll increase the herd size, which takes a long time. So again, in the long run, supply will be more elastic. In the short run, less elastic. But that's especially true for natural resources. If we're talking about manufactured goods, though, you'll have a more elastic supply curve. The quantity supplied will be more responsive to a change in price. Because in this example, if there's a change in price and we're discussing automobiles, an employer could go to the day shift, 8 to 4 p.m., and say we're offering overtime from 4 to midnight, or they could just add a shift, a second shift. And if that's not enough, they could even have what's called a graveyard shift from midnight to 8 a.m. and have the factories working 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so you get a much larger change in quantity supplied for manufactured goods in the short run than you will for natural goods in the short run. Elasticity of supply, how responsive quantity supplied is to a change in price.